Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Long.
We're going to talk today about airline deregulation in Indiana cities, something that might affect your late summer or even winter travel plans. We're going to talk about the federal deficit, the foreign trade imbalance, and our new status as a debtor nation, something that's more interesting than it sounds. And we're going to talk about a couple of anniversaries, that of the atomic bomb and that of the Berlin Wall. How do these things affect Hoosiers? Panelists for today's Public Affairs Roundtable include Bill Mosier from marketing, Neil Palumbo from economics, and John Rouse from political science. Bill Mosier, we've been in a deregulation mode for some time now. How does the deregulation of airlines in Indiana affect me and you?
Larry, I think we really should look. You mentioned about it being for some time. Actually, the act that brought this deregulation on was passed in '78, and it was a phased deregulation where it went from '79 to '84, where there were stages of adjustment that were involved. The effect has been really truly varied in terms of the different locations. You actually have a situation where there are some airlines that served us, as well as other parts of the country, that have gone bankrupt. There have been new airlines that have sprung up as a result of the fact that it is more openly competitive and this sort of thing. And you've also had a significant effect in terms of the locations, the manner of service provided to different locations, and things of this nature. This is something where the deregulation really started during a period that was very turbulent for the airlines. You had fuel prices that were going up very, very strongly and rapidly. Then they dropped off, and so you had a kind of an up and down situation on that. You also had the air traffic controller strike during this same period, and so that was another turbulent aspect of what was happening to the airlines and to the people that use the airlines, because there were a lot of changes going on. The other thing that comes to mind as far as this period, when you think about the changes and all the things that sometimes you have to look at and say, was it due to deregulation or was it due to some of the other things involved, was the fact that we were going into a recession. And so you had a lot less travel that was going on at that same time. So obviously, anytime you have a reduction in the volume and the revenue and the business, then the more efficient ones are going to survive. The less efficient ones are really going to have a very rough time of surviving the process.
And we're just now feeling the effects or the real effects of what deregulation was intended?
I really think so, Larry, because the thing didn't really become completely operative until the end of '84. And so we're just now really seeing it in its full-blown effect, and quite frankly, I think there's still going to be some adjustment. But I really, from everybody I read and all the information that I can get, there are a lot of people that think that things are going to settle down somewhat in the industry.
So how's this affecting consumer? Is service better, prices better?
I don't want to beg the question. I want to say very honestly it's very mixed. Okay, let's look at places in Indiana. And you can see places where service is better and more available, and other places where it's relatively unchanged or even less. Gary, for example, has air service now that it did not have it, hasn't had it for 27 years. And so there's something where there is more people there that have it available to them. For example, South Bend, you have more airlines serving and you have more departures daily. It went, I believe, from 3 to 5 departures daily, something of this nature, but there was a change, a significantly favorable change to the people. Fort Wayne, you had an increase in the number of airlines serving, and you had an increase in Fort Wayne was fairly stable in terms of the number of departures on a daily basis. Lafayette, you had very little change. It was something that was some decrease in departures, same number of airlines, 2 airlines serving Lafayette. Indianapolis, of course, we have to look at Indianapolis and recognize the fact that there's been all sorts of changes in terms of its role as in terms of all the sports things and this sort of thing. There's been just a tremendous change in Indianapolis itself. So then you have to say, well, is it due to what the airlines are doing of their own initiative, or are they responding to the demand that's there for their services and for their business. Indianapolis increased significantly, though. You actually had an increase both in airlines, and you went from 135 to 150 departures a day in Indianapolis. Bloomington, fairly stable, not a lot of change. Evansville had an increased number of airlines serving it and the number of departures. And so you can see that there's very real differences in how it affects different consumers. In other words, it's truly, I would like to think, more responsive to the conditions that are involved. There's one other thing that strikes me in thinking about this, and that is we look historically, we've always thought of airlines and other modes of transportation as being something very regulated and very defined in terms of what they could do and they couldn't do, and now we've thrown it more into a free enterprise, true, open, whoever can survive type situation. Looking at all the different places that could possibly have subsidy from the federal government due to the fact that the service was needed and it was not a profitable situation. The only one that is eligible that is using the subsidy is there is a line that services from Kokomo to Chicago, but actually Muncie is eligible. Let's see, Lafayette is, Elkhart is, and Terre Haute, and they're all the lines that serve them are adequately profitable, that they're not going for the subsidy. They've not even applied for it. So again,
this sounds like an issue that's not very, well, exciting in a way. Is it all as cut and dried or laid out as you have explained it?
Not at all, John. I don't think it's cut and dried. And one, if we look at some of the things that are happening, probably the one that is absolutely not cut and dried and nobody really thinks that it's going to be is the issue of prices. The price situation it has exploded in terms of the competitive situation to the point that it almost overwhelms, from every reading I've gained, it overwhelms the computers to try to keep pace with all of the possibilities, all the options, and all the consideration, and all the changes. And nothing that I can see really do they think that it's going to change in this respect. So what we have then is we had a very stable and a very controlled situation historically as far as the service and the prices. When it was thrown open, then you have a situation where you have airlines that may go out of business. So you have service one day and next month you don't have service. You have a situation where the pricing situation is you really have to, as a consumer, shop around. It's not as, so it's very uncut and dried. So there are some very different types of effects, and it is truly more open, more aggressive, and less predictable in what's going to happen.
So you're saying that it is really, as it was set out to be, more competitive than it used to be?
I don't think there's any question that it is, and I think it's more competitive than some of the people that were more comfortable with the traditional situation were ready to deal with. In other words, a lot of people would rather have stability and have things maybe not at the ideal and not have to deal with the unpredictability of change. So you have some people that are very favorable in terms of cities. It's very interesting. You traditionally had places, locations that they knew that they would have air service because it was federally mandated. Now the cities have to sell the airlines on serving them. They have to go out and sell their community as a place that the airline wants to serve. So it changes that relationship between the airlines and the cities. And it makes the people who are the officials in the different cities throughout the state really have to go out and go after it and aggressively promote. Indianapolis has done this a number of times with the airlines where they've gone after particular ones that we want a route and really lobbied with the airlines. So that changes that relationship without any question. Indianapolis, incidentally, has a unique situation in this whole ball game because normally in air service you talk about, they use terms such as hub and spoke, and a hub is a very central location that then you'll have other locations that will be around that will feed into that. And Indianapolis is really in a unique situation where it is truly too close to other hubs to be a hub and too big to be a legitimate spoke. So quite frankly, it probably could have gained even more in the deregulation than it did. It gained significantly, but I think it gained more on its own development in the city than on its role because Chicago, and St. Louis both are considered to be hubs, and that puts Indianapolis, quite frankly, too close. And it's really kind of a betwixt and between type of a role as far as what it really does.
That'd make Indianapolis a spud, then, I guess.
Well, I don't know whether that they might not agree to that, but again, I can respond and say that they don't feel like their business is any small potatoes. But then again,
just as well we don't mention that.
but I will say that I really feel that the intense price competition is definitely going to increase. I don't think there's any question that this is something that is going to happen, and you're going to have more of this unpredictability and this sort of thing.
So if you're a frequent flyer or you're interested in free market economics, you can get excited about this.
That would be that's where it really talks to you in a language that you relate to.
Okay. You'd mentioned controlled and you'd mentioned stable. I guess those are two words, Neil Palumbo, we probably could not use when we talk about budget making and budget deficits.
Definitely not.
Understanding that the President's going to ask Congress to raise the debt ceiling again. Where are we headed? Deeper in the red?
Right now, that's what it looks like. Let me start my comments by piggybacking a little bit on what Bill was just talking about. And, from an economics point of view, you really like, in general, not every aspect maybe, but in general, you like what's happening with the deregulation of the airline industry. It's getting more competitive. It's getting healthier. You have a hard time selling that to someone who's going to take a cut in pay or someone whose business just went under. But that happens in competitive companies all the time. In fact, if we would argue in economics, if it wasn't for competition, the United States would still be a very weak, agrarian, low manufacturing, very uninteresting economy. But there was, enormous resources, a tremendous opportunity, and then we mixed that opportunity with competition, basically, and we got, we think, some very fine results. And the airline industry also, I think, will show fine results. What does that got to do with the deficit? Well, the deficit, unfortunately, is now getting so large and shows no sign of shrinking that I think it is going to start putting a real damper on our international competitiveness. The United States, for a period of time after World War II, leading up to and after World War II, was the dominant economy in the world. We would like that to continue forever. That is, those of us who were prospering from that, and others obviously wouldn't want it to. But the normal flow and take of give and take of international trade and competition is that countries rise to the top, and then they don't necessarily fall to the bottom. But then you have this competition, and you go up and down. You have cycles, and so a lot of the competition we're getting from Japan now is healthy, is normal. But we're compounding that. We in the United States are compounding that by these very large deficits. We insist on spending a large amounts of our resources on government activities and not raising taxes accordingly. And Congress has got to, hopefully soon, decide what they're not going to spend money on or what the private sector is not going to spend money on by raising taxes. And if we don't do that, we're sort of having a nice party here in the United States, in a sense, and running up a big bill. And the bill is going to come due in 5 or 10 years, and it's going to come due in us being less competitive than we should be. And we could talk about, keeping out foreign competition, but that's not going to work.
Start with at home, the Reagan economic mix. I mean, we cut taxes, we deregulate, right. We create a strong economy, people end up, it generates more taxation, it cuts the federal deficit. Right. Where didn't that work?
So far, where it didn't work is that the cut in taxes was just did not generate enough economic growth. We have the growth, we've had growth, but the tax cut was just too large for the amount of programs that we wish to finance as a government. So the question comes down to either there are one or more programs or a whole mix of programs that we want to reduce or eliminate. And if we cannot agree on a mix of programs that we want to reduce or eliminate, and they could be defense program, non-defense, Social Security, you name it. But if each of us has a very compelling reason for keeping that program at its level, and if we all agree, well, okay, that one can't be reduced, this one can't be reduced, this one can't be reduced, then we eventually have to come to the conclusion that unless economic growth explodes tomorrow, which is not going to happen. I mean, it'll continue, hopefully, but it's not going to explode positively. Then we just simply have to shift. If the public sector must have these programs of defense, of Social Security, of education, of manpower training, and on and on and on. If we must have that mix of programs and we can't reduce it, then we have to pay for it.
Your argument is it's about time we're going to have to start thinking about paying the piper for the party here.
So.
We're either going to have to raise taxes dramatically or really get serious about cutting spending. And
one or the other.
There's been no indication that they're serious about cutting spending.
No, it seems that the compromise, well, I could be wrong, but my reading of the compromise that just came out of Congress before Congress decided to go on vacation, which is normal at this time of year, was not much of a compromise, and it is very disappointing. And I'm not saying that we have to raise taxes or we have to cut. In other words, I'm not saying which side we have to do. Hopefully it would be a mix of the two. But something has to be done. And the current status quo means the deficit is far larger than it should be. It means, in my opinion, our international trade imbalance is larger than it should be. It would not be small. It would not be zero without the deficit, but it's larger than it should be. It means we're getting more foreign investment than is normal. For this year, for next year, it probably doesn't mean a great, as I say, we're at the party. It's nice. It's not too bad. But a few years down the road, there's going to be a wrenching problem. Now, the economy is not going to collapse. The U.S. economy is strong. It'll remain strong. We're a wealthy nation. We'll remain a wealthy nation. It just means we're going to pay a price later on with unemployment, unusual period of unemployment, with certain industries becoming even losing out even more business than they should, or we're going to pay the price by saying, okay, the heck with foreign trade, let's close our borders to foreign trade or reduce, and that would be terrible because then the other countries are not going to sit around and take that. And in fact, the matter is, while we are not going to have, I'm not predicting a Great Depression like the 1930s at all because we're a totally different world. On the other hand, a driving force of the 1930s Great Depression was the walls against international trade. And that is something we must avoid. And in order to avoid it, we have to reduce government programs and or increase taxes, then we should get on to that business.
What you warn of sounds like it would be particularly bad for Indiana. During the recent recession, we were one of the hardest hit, one of the last to recover. It sounds like if we get into the same situation you're talking about, again, high unemployment, then Indiana is going to suffer probably more than many other states.
Yeah, all of us will share in the pain, as all of us share in the benefits. But Indiana, being having a good deal of manufacturing plant sites, and yet also being heavily into agriculture, Indiana's got a nice, interesting mix. And when we do things right at the national level, Indiana should prosper from it. But if indeed we are wrong, if these deficits are as much of a problem as I think they are, and if we don't do anything about them, and if they lead to this price, yes, Indiana's share of the price will be, again, not total or anything abnormal, but it will be unusually high. And what it'll do is it'll defeat, if what I'm talking about it comes out this way, it'll defeat a lot of the good work that the economy and the state is doing. A lot of the work that people in Indiana are working at very hard in the farming area and in the manufacturing area, a lot of things we're doing to attract industry and get industry to expand, a lot of that, not all of it, but a lot of that is going to be defeated if indeed the deficit stays so large that it begins to depress the U.S. economy, because we are part of that economy. If, on the other hand, we can get that deficit just a little more in control, honestly in control, and so this way the foreign investment will continue in our country, but at a more modest pace, and our foreign trade will continue, but at a more normal pace, I think then we can maybe avoid, and then a lot of the programs that Indiana is trying to put into effect in the area of economic development, I think we'll stand a much better chance for being successful.
Neil, it strikes me that there are two very strong issues that due to the timing of this. You're talking about the fact that we may, as a result of this situation, be weakened in our ability to be competitive in the world market or the world trade and this sort of thing. And it strikes me that this is a particularly inopportune time for that to happen, since it's becoming more and more of a world market, and the whole business thing is moving in that direction. So there's more opportunity there than there was historically. But the other thing that strikes me, I would think that it's very, very difficult to accomplish some of this backpedaling that needs to be done, because we have so much more focus on special interest situations in the United States, where there's a lot more fragmentation of the different interest groups that are pushing for their program or this sort of thing. So it's particularly difficult. I'm not trying to justify Congress' situation, but it tells you how difficult it's going to be for them to do that.
Yeah, all I'm saying, by the way, I admit it's extremely difficult, but I guess the only point I'm really saying is, if Congress can't reduce programs, they must increase taxes. They can't, they just got to do one or the other. They cannot, I can't, what I'm trying to say is that they cannot look at the program and say nobody can reduce these programs, and then look at the tax and says nobody can increase these taxes, therefore we'll go on with our current situation. That's the worst thing they can possibly do.
So they've got to face reality. That's what they're not doing.
Yeah. And they will face it. Congress will face reality. But if it's 4 years from now, we're going to pay a bigger price.
The frustration I have with this, and I think the person who's watching will also have the frustration, is that what you're implying is that our standard of living is going to go down. And as long as we spend like this, it is going to go down. But the question is, how is this going to impact our society? It seems like a very vague issue, very difficult to get a handle on. What's going to be the impact that the person in the street, so to speak, can tell from this? I'd
say that what we're seeing is that the extremely wealthy position that the U.S. has occupied is changing. That is true, and this happens. You know, if the status quo was always the same, and the status quo was as of 150 years ago, we would not like that situation. We would prefer the status quo of today, of course. I and you would. Well, most people would in the United States. But yes, I think standards of living narrowly measured are bound to go down a little bit for a while as competition takes hold. But one thing competition, I think, has taught us is that if we do it right, eventually all of us are better off. Not only Japan, the United States, but Korea and Russia and Canada and Mexico. So yeah, our standard of living may fluctuate, but we can't stop time. We can't stop situation. We can't stop competition. Say, well, we're at the top now. Now the game's over. I've won the game. The game goes on, whether we like it or not. And okay, there may be a little downturn, but if we do things right, we'll have our upturns again. But if we compound that downturn by ignoring reality and spending our money in an enormous deficit, I think then what's going to happen is a few years from now we're going to pay an even sharper downturn price. What's going to happen is some companies that should be competitive with Japan are going to be less competitive. Some companies that should be surviving the next downturn are not going to. And so, you know, there's going to be a price to pay, but I like to look at the long term, you know, look ahead. The competition always extracts a price, but on balance it normally makes everyone better off. And that's what we want. And besides, even if our standard of living by some narrow measure goes down for a while, our quality of life hopefully will improve. And that's another whole issue. But
in our last few minutes, sorry, Bill. In our last few minutes, John Rouse, let's look at reality, but let's look behind. Let's look at these anniversaries that we talked at the top of the program. The atomic bomb, the Berlin Wall, seemingly separate issues. Is there some combined meaning to these?
Well, Larry, I think it's very important for us to talk about these kinds of issues because if we look at the bomb, it was dropped 40 years ago. The Berlin Wall has been up now for 24 years. In a sense, they are separate kinds of issues, and we here in Indiana ought to look at the dynamics of international politics, of course, and the question is that everybody is asking, should Truman have dropped the bomb? That question is certainly asked out of context. If it were asked in the context of the time between 1939 and 1945, it would have certainly been in context. It is estimated, for example, if the bomb had not been dropped, if Japan had not been brought to her knees, that it would have cost 500,000 lives in American military personnel. And also, for example, in terms of the battles that occurred in the Pacific, we lost, I believe, 12,000 men on Okinawa. The Japanese lost 110,000 men. So there would have also been the possibility of additional deaths occurring in Japan. Now, as far as the Berlin Wall is concerned, the Berlin Wall is the good side of the nuclear stalemate. And also, we might say that what occurred is that with the dropping of the bomb, we saw just how disastrous the bomb was in terms of what it could do. And perhaps because we saw it in 1945, we have not had one drop since that time. So the Berlin Wall would be a case where there's a stalemate, and so therefore both powers realized that what would occur would be something much worse than 1945 that occurred in Japan.
Yeah, well, it represents the Cold War as opposed to the Hot War.
Yeah. And perhaps in terms of looking at this issue further, the Japanese, of course, have been under the umbrella of the American military establishment. They have not had to devote resources to military. So in that sense, they have gotten by easy. In turn, they have put their industries into the competition that they have with this country.
Yeah. And?
The issue is one, again, that is taken out of context.
But this is from the American perspective you're talking about. I mean, we've got Nakasone, we have other world leaders saying it was an inhumane thing to do to drop the atomic bomb.
But it would have, if you look at the policies of the Japanese during World War II as far as their fighting ability, they would have perhaps never given up their homeland. It would have taken a great deal. As I said, the estimate is that it would have cost 500,000 American lives, deaths in Japan. We had just come out of the theater in Europe. We had lost about 250,000 men there. There were 13 million Germans killed in World War II. There were 20 million Russians killed in World War II. And so all of this is in a sense, out of context.
And all is fair in love and war. Is that what you're saying then?
Well, the important thing that I'm trying to emphasize is that we have to look at the fact that our population really, or most of our population, has very little feeling about the deaths and the conflicts. Basically, everything in life, in society, around the world has been evolutionary. What Bill and Neil have talked about are evolutionary things. The period between 1945 and back to 1939 was a very revolutionary time in the history of man.
We've gone as far as we can evolve here today. Thanks to our panelists, Bill Mosier, Neil Paloma, John Rouse. I'm Larry Law. Thank you for being with us. Sorry, I had to throw it.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producer is Mike Seaborn. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.